In December 2017, an artificial intelligence system stunned the chess community by defeating the strongest chess engine in the world. DeepMind's AlphaZero learned to play chess on its own from tabula rasa, with the only input being the rules of the game. Then, after only 4 hours of self-play, it was capable of winning a match against the world champion of engines, Stockfish. In this video, we are going to take a look at a game that DeepMind has just released from the match between AlphaZero and Stockfish and see how the playing style and attacking chess of AlphaZero compares to computers and to humans. Let's begin. AlphaZero, playing with the white pieces, started this game with one knight f3, knight f6, and c4. One of the favorite openings of AlphaZero is the English opening. e6, knight c3, bishop b4, queen c2, castle, a3, bishop takes, queen takes c3. So far everything is normal. I'm going to pause in a moment after a5, b4, d6, e3, knight e4, queen c2, knight g5, and b5. This is the first moment I wanted to highlight in this game. After the knight move, knight g5, this pawn on b4 is hanging. Black is threatening to take it. There's a pin on the a file. A natural move to prevent this threat would be bishop to b2, defending the rook. And if a takes b4, a takes b4, rook takes a1 check, bishop takes a1. There's a trade on f3, for instance, and this is just a normal position. A very human-like position. But AlphaZero prefers to play b5, keep more pieces on the board. And at the same time, he doesn't mind that after the trade on f3, knight takes f3, check, g takes f3, queen f6 is a double attack. It picks up a pawn since both the rook and the f3 pawn are hanging. Either bishop b2 or d4 happened in the game, but in both cases, black is going to win this pawn on f3. Queen takes f3. Rook g1, knight d7, developing the knight, heading toward f6, and now simply bishop e2. Queen f6 and bishop b2. What is it that AlphaZero has for the sacrificed pawn? The pair of bishops and the initiative. But furthermore, after queen h4, attacking the h2 pawn, AlphaZero, instead of defending this pawn with a move like rook g2, which might be a little passive, or bishop f3, which is improving the bishop, and in case of queen takes h2, rook h1 would trap the queen. So bishop f3 could be a very human-like move, a human way of continuing the game, minding that this pawn cannot be captured. What did AlphaZero do? None of these, of course. He plays rook g4, and I'm gonna say he because I feel like it's a he or she or they. I don't know, but it's certainly superhuman to me. Rook g4, provoking black to take a second pawn. This is the second pawn sacrifice in the game. And after queen takes h2, what was the big plan? Why did he sacrifice a second pawn? To retreat to g3 with the rook, as if nothing happened. What's the point of rook g3? Well, in many positions, knight f6 would come with a tempo. So it already thinks about moving away the rook from this move and at the same time restricting the black's queen's mobility. What happens if queen h1 check? Well, AlphaZero simply would have played king to d2, not minding that it cannot castle anymore, and the rook comes into play as well with attack on the king side. So after rook g3, Stockfish plays f5. Very logical, because it wants to close the king side, defend the h7 pawn. Castle queen side, logical, to bring the second rook as well to the king side. But this move offers yet another pawn. So yes, it's a developing move, bringing all the pieces of white to the attack, but the f2 pawn could have been captured if Stockfish wanted to, although it was a very risky choice. After rook d g1, rook f7, rook 1 to g2 is what I analyzed, queen e1 check, bishop d1, and there's certainly lots of play for the sacrificed material, but let's just remember that white has already given up three pawns. This is one example of how the game could have continued if the f2 pawn was captured. Still nothing concrete going on. White is 3 pawns down, but all the white pieces are active and attacking, while black has a very vulnerable king and his pieces are not in harmony, not developed, and they are not coordinating very well. 3 pawns sacrificed. Instead of the capture on f2, rook f7 was played in the game. And now bishop f3 threatens to win the queen with rook h1. So black has to go back, queen h4, rook h1 still, of course. And after queen f6, how do you think AlphaZero continued his attack? Once again, apologies that I'm calling him a him or her or them. Superhuman. In this position, after sacrificing 2 pawns, AlphaZero goes for the attack with the very strong king b1. He doesn't mind that he's 2 pawns down. He doesn't care that he would need to prove immediately with the initiative and with some brilliant attack what he has as a compensation for the sacrificed material. AlphaZero thinks about chess in a completely different way. Since the only input that was programmed into AlphaZero are the rules, how the pieces move. It doesn't have a value system that we stick to. It doesn't count pawns as 1 point, a bishop and knight as 3, a rook as 5. It doesn't give a numeric value to the pieces. It values chess and sees chess in a completely different way. And that's why these games are brilliant, because suddenly we can also start seeing this ancient board game from a completely different perspective, from an alien-like, superhuman-like perspective, I feel like. King b1 is a prophylactic move, and AlphaZero is not in a rush at all to show what it has for the sacrificed material. g6, and now rook g to g1. You might wonder why. Well, after g6, black is threatening f4. It was not possible earlier, since the h7 pawn would have been hanging in case of this push. So the f pawn can now be advanced after g6, and white simply moves away with the rook from it. It could be asked, why not rook to h3? Attacking on the h5, right? Isn't it what white wants, a kingside attack? Well, there isn't so much of an attack going on h7, since it's defended by the rook, and black can also bring the knight if necessary. So what is the rook doing on g1, you might ask? You shall soon see. a5 was played by black, and in general the problem with black's position I wanted to highlight, by the way, is that it's very difficult for black to develop his pieces. Once again, her pieces, let's call it her pieces now. Black would love to develop the c8 bishop, but he can't push b6 because of the pin on the long diagonal. He would need to play rook b8 and then b6 in order to push b6 and then bishop b7. But that takes ages. And also the a5 pawn could be vulnerable. It pushes a4 so that it gains some space on the queen side. But still, it doesn't solve black's development issues. So yes, it creates more space for black, but still the same issues occur. And that is basically what AlphaZero sees in this position, that his pieces, all the white pieces, are very active. AlphaZero loves activity, mobility, and it also loves when the opponent has basically the opposite, struggling with moving, struggling to mobilize its pieces. So that is what it sees for the 2 pawns. And that's why, once again, he is not in a rush at all and plays after a4 the move king to a1. When I saw this move, I was like, what on earth? But yeah, king a1, yet another prophylactic move. White is not in a rush at all because black is struggling. Black is struggling to find a way to coordinate its pieces. His pieces, her pieces. Once again, apologies for the pronouns. e4, finally the moment arrived when white starts to open up the position. This is what we know as humans, right? When you have the initiative, when all your pieces are developed and the opponent is lacking development, the opponent is struggling to finish his development, and you should open up the position. And that is what AlphaZero is doing. Now, this move is totally human-like, of course, e4. And after f4, c5. Let's continue trying to open up the position. Open phi's, open diagonals. That's what he's aiming for. Queen e7. And now, remember when AlphaZero went from g3 to g1 with his rook. Here we go! That rook suddenly appears on the queen's side. Who said that white can only attack on the king's side? Well, no one. AlphaZero proves that he can play on both flanks. Actually, on the king's side, on the queen side, and in the center as well. White is playing on all parts of the board, while black still hasn't finished development. Knight f6 was played by Stockfish, and here e5. Continuing with the idea of opening up the position for white's pieces. D takes e5. And here, well, a normal move could be d takes e5, but an even stronger move is AlphaZero's continuation, rook h to e1. Yes, tons of pawns down, but he doesn't care. He has just opened up the e file, and if black takes on d4, capturing yet another pawn, then he would be in trouble after queen c4. Queen takes d4 next move, and this long diagonal is a killer. White's pieces are way too active, the attack is very strong. This position, I don't think, can be held. So rook ag1, a beautiful move, and Stockfish decides that he has to give back some of the material, pushes e4. If the bishop takes e4, queen f8, moving away from the e file. Taking on e4 wouldn't have helped much, so queen f8 is a better try because this f6 knight is a useful defender. Black doesn't want to give up that piece. Now in this position, this was my favorite moment of the game. So far we have seen that AlphaZero loves mobility, activity, doesn't mind giving up material, it doesn't mind that there's no immediate compensation. Actually, it loves sacrificing material for long-term strategic advantages. And long-term strategic advantage is what he has in this moment too. But he has to do something. He has to continue improving his position. So, what he does here is a move that Stockfish did not see at all. At least not my Stockfish. I analyzed this game with Stockfish on my computer, and I left this position with Stockfish on for a long time, trying to see if Stockfish will recommend me the move that AlphaZero played in this position. I chose the top 10 moves of Stockfish, and none of them even mentioned the move that's coming now. Pawn to d5. Yes, it opens up the long diagonal, but it's another pawn sacrifice. And the point of it is that after e takes d5, white will play another retreating move, bishop to d3, like as if nothing happened. 3 pawns down, bishop coming back to d3, life is great. This is how AlphaZero plays. d5. Let me just emphasize once again, Stockfish, at least the Stockfish I have on my computer, with the depth I can use it, doesn't see d5 at all. c6 was the other candidate move of AlphaZero, and that is a move that Stockfish considers. But d5, the move that AlphaZero finally chose in this moment, no mention or whatsoever by Stockfish, not in the top 10 moves. I thought that is just fascinating. E takes d5, bishop d3. So yeah, here we go, 3 pawns down. All the pawns of white are disappearing slowly, but what he has are 2 beautiful bishops. Look at these bishops, monsters. The opening file, The queen is also very well placed, and he will take some use of the c1 rook as well. We shall see how. We shall see how the c1 rook will be activated. That's the only piece that is not as active as the rest of the white pieces. Black can finally develop his bishop on move 31. Bishop to g4. And what does AlphaZero do? Well, sacrifice yet another pawn. Of course. f3. Now this pawn is poisoned. If bishop takes f3, then rook f1, bishop e4, rook takes f4, and black's position collapses because of the pins. Everything is pinned. The knight will drop if rook f7, rook c2, f1, and you cannot hold the position. Black is losing material. So f3 finally is a pawn sacrifice that actually can't be accepted. Bishop back to d7, and now queen to c3. AlphaZero slowly starts improving his position even further. So the queen is now on the long diagonal, and after knight h5, he improves the rook. Rook to e5. It's very active here, and also gives space to the other rook. Remember that the c1 rook was not so useful. Now it's a time to activate the c1 rook as well. c6 was played by Stockfish, and now rook c to e1. All the white pieces are playing and are attacking. Knight f6. What shall we do if we are AlphaZero? Well, improve the position even further. In a very positional way, just tiny steps of improving, progressing. Queen d4. The queen is better on d4 than on c3. And just remember, we are only 3 pawns down, so why hurry? Queen to d4, threatening the f4 pawn. C takes b5, because that pawn was hanging, yeah. But white does not care. Bishop to b1. Let me replay this move. Bishop to b1. Yes. What is the bishop doing on b1, you might ask? It wasn't as useful on d3 according to AlphaZero. And what's great about AlphaZero's moves is that it takes advantage of the fact what we know. A bishop is a long-range piece. It still covers the same diagonal from b1 as from d3. And at the same time, it's about to change to another diagonal if necessary. Bishop to a2 could come in the future, putting pressure on the new weakness. That pawn, after c takes b5, the d5 pawn is a new target, and white immediately goes for it. Bishop b1 with a potential idea of bishop a2 in the future. Just to show you how dangerous this position is already for black, if Stockfish had played, for instance, rook to c8, white can play rook takes d5, exchange sacrifice, knight takes d5, queen takes d5 check, and after queen f7, back to d4 as if nothing happened, and now bishop a2 will be very painful, picking up material, and also this diagonal, the two bishops are killing black's position. So, after bishop b1, huge threat, rook takes d5, therefore black plays bishop to c6, defending the pawn. But that gives up the e6 square, and AlphaZero keeps on improving the position, rook to e6, gaining more and more space, more and more mobility, more and more activity for its pieces. The f6 knight is hanging and is about to fall. Actually, Stockfish decides to sacrifice the knight. Knight h5 could have been played, not that black's sufferings would have ended here, but it decides that he would rather give up the knight on f6, but trade pieces. So in this position, AlphaZero could take this knight. What happens afterwards is that at least Stockfish manages to trade a couple of pieces. Stockfish would be a piece down, but there's no danger against the black king anymore. This position should be winning for white, but instead of capturing the knight, instead of being greedy, instead of playing the human way of why not win a piece if it's hanging right, AlphaZero plays rook to g1. It says, well, the knight is hanging, the knight is not going anywhere. You can't move the knight as black because of queen h8 mate, so why hurry with the capture? AlphaZero plays rook g1, because in the future, he might just sacrifice on g6 too, because we have only sacrificed 3 pawns so far, or 4, I can't even count anymore. And yeah, why not sacrifice a piece 2 on g6 instead of winning the knight on f6? It doesn't go anywhere, right? Queen to g7. And once again, it would be possible to take this knight, but AlphaZero doesn't care. It takes the pawn instead, because this pawn was more important to AlphaZero than the knight. Here, if black wants to, he could defend the knight with rook a to f8. But Stockfish doesn't do it. Stockfish plays rook e8, trying to trade pieces. So once again, same strategy. He's hoping for a position where, even though he would be a piece down, at least he is trading pieces, trading the queen and so on. What do you think AlphaZero has done? What is the move that he played in this position after rook e8? Capturing the knight on f6, going for a piece up endgame? No way. It compares what happens after the trade on f6. He would lose some of his active pieces. So instead, he plays rook to d6, keeping the pressure on the f6 knight with all the 3 pieces that he has there, and keeping all the active pieces too. So bishop takes f6 is a threat. If black finally defends the knight on f6, just like he could have done it a move earlier, rook to f8, simply a move like queen to g5 is a killer, because black cannot move his pieces. He's paralyzed. All the pieces are tied down to the defense of the f6 knight. The c6 bishop can barely move either. This position is almost a zugzwang for black, with so many pieces being just very passive, tied down to the defense. And this is the AlphaZero way of playing. Sacrificing material for the mobility of his own pieces in order to restrict the opponent's pieces, gaining a strategic advantage in this way, long-term strategic advantage. This didn't happen in the game. After rook d6, Stockfish tries to get rid of the pin. Knight d7, tactical move, both queens are hanging. And queen c1. Remember the long-range pieces? Yes, the queen is also powerful from c1, as powerful as on f4. Because I'm sure most of us would have just looked at queen g5, and it's a great move. But instead, AlphaZero decides that the queen is just as good on c1. Look at these pieces. Bishops on b1 and b2, queen on c1. Who cares, right? They are just as strong from the distance as having them close to the black king. At least according to AlphaZero. And this is very inspiring to see how he is building up the attack. So now the black queen is hanging. And there isn't much choice. If queen e8, there's already a problem on the g6 square, so black decides to give up material. Rook f6. What do you think AlphaZero played in this position? You can pause the video and calculate all the captures on f6. Because that's what a human would do, right? Well, maybe not. This bishop actually is very powerful. And I think we humans understand this too. So it's not that AlphaZero plays alien-like moves, superhuman moves. In this position, I think we all understand that the b2 bishop is the most powerful piece of white. And we don't want to give it up for an exchange. Bishop takes f6 would be like, oh no, that was my best piece. It's such a beast on b2, on the long diagonal. I don't want to give it up for an exchange. So that's what AlphaZero does too. f4. Simply continues with the attack, wanting to push f5 to open up the g file if possible. Queen e7, moving away from the pin. And now the rook can finally move. Rook takes d6 is a threat. What do you think AlphaZero played here? Bishop takes f6, finally? Well, no. Of course not. AlphaZero believes that this bishop is stronger and more necessary for his attack than the rook. So he has to take on f6 with either the rook or the bishop, and he chooses the rook. Rook takes f6, exclamation mark. If bishop takes f6, which is also a very tempting move, right? Knight takes f6, And the queen can replace the bishop on the long diagonal, so this position too looks very promising. It could be winning for white. But AlphaZero prefers rook takes f6, keeping the b2 bishop alive. After knight takes f6, f5, attacking on the g file, f takes g6 is the next move. Black's position is collapsing. Stockfish finally manages to trade queens. After queen e3, f takes g6. Yes, he's losing some of the pawns that he gained during the entire game. Queen takes c1, g takes h7, check. Intermediate move, very important. King f7, and now rook takes c1. In this position, let's just count. It is still a pawn down for AlphaZero, but this pawn, the h7 pawn, is about to promote. It is worth at least a piece. And rook f1 is a huge threat as well, winning the f6 knight. The rook cannot move from the back rank because of the promotion. So black is losing material and the game. Here, I think humans too would win this game because we can see all these threats. Black has to give up the knight for the pawn and therefore will be a piece down. So finally, AlphaZero is a piece up as he could have been 10 moves ago, but he didn't want to have material up. He prefers mobility, activity, and just simply having a position where he has all the play, all the control, and the opponent struggles to find activity, struggles to find a plan. So piece up and a winning position. It isn't very difficult to win this position for humans either, but we are going to see the AlphaZero way of converting this into a full point. After rook e3, we're going to see how he improves his position step by step. Rook to d1, king e8, and now king a2. Of course, he has to activate the king. King a2 is not where it will stay forever, but for now, that's one step ahead, because after bishop d7, he can finally move the bishop since the king defended the a3 pawn. Rook h3, and now the bishop comes back to c2. Bishop to e6, and let's continue. Rook e1, king d7, and the king can come a little closer. King to b2, rook f3, and now improving further. Rook e5, rook g3. The g3 rook is cutting the white king, and therefore rook e3, offering this trade of rooks, is the best continuation and allowing next king to c3. Rook g2, king c3. Rook g4. We can't go to b4 because of the hanging bishop. Therefore, AlphaZero plays rook f3, and after king e8, rook f2, a little bit of maneuvering, and after the check, well, here we go, king b4, rook g4 back, and rook d2. He was going to play rook d2 anyway, so if you wonder why Stockfish gave a check, rook d2 could have come anyway to defend the d4 bishop and prepare king b4, king a5, king b6, infiltrating black's camp. So rook g3 check, king b4, rook g4, rook d2, bishop d7, king a5. There we go, the white king has arrived. Rook f4. Now improving the bishop because it has done its job on the fourth rank, covering up for the king. Rook f3, rook d3, defending the a3 pawn. Rook f2. Bishop comes back to the back rank because AlphaZero loves the bishops on the back rank, and the queen too. Just kidding, it's nice on d1 for the moment. It is just well played. It can come later to g4 and h5, but what happened was that the game is over. Stockfish resigned in this position after king b6. It's a piece up and white has activated the king, so basically this position is already completely lost for black. I thought that this game was fascinating. I loved the multiple pawn sacrifices and that there was nothing concrete about any of them. Remember the first pawn sacrifice, it wasn't even necessary. Offering the f3 pawn after knight g5, playing b5, instead of the very natural bishop b2, which would have kept the material equality. So b5 was the first pawn sacrifice, allowing the double attack with queen f6. And later, when black attacked the h2 pawn, instead of bishop f3, which is an active move defending the h2 pawn, what AlphaZero did was to provoke black to capture the second pawn, telling him, go for it, that's what you wanted. Just to play a retreating move afterwards. 2 pawns down and plays rook g3. Couple of moves later, we see that the third pawn is offered, wasn't taken immediately, but later, when we have this on the board, with rooks on the g and h file, you feel like something should be happening immediately, right? Looking at moves like d5 or e4, if they can work, you try to make them work. They are not working, so you don't play them, but still you want to do something immediately because you are 2 pawns down. No, AlphaZero plays king to b1 because the king is not so well placed on c1. Prophylactic move king b1, and after g6, when f4 is threatened, comes back just simply to g1 with the rook. Nothing's happening. Black cannot finish development, and that gives white lots of time. So even though we know normally that when you have the initiative and when you have sacrificed material, you should hurry with your attack, you should prove what you have, compensate for the material that you sacrificed. AlphaZero showed that with this game, if your opponent's pieces are not ideally placed, here black is lacking development and cannot coordinate his pieces, it is just enough compensation. So he has time for king b1, he has time for king a1, and after he has played those prophylactic moves, finally he goes for opening up the position with e4 and c5, and this g1 rook comes to the queen side, because why not play on both flanks? We don't have to attack just on the king side, because that's where we sacrifice the pawns. And my favorite moment of the game, after e4, bishop takes e4, queen f8, is when here the move is d5, just giving up once again a third pawn so that he can retreat to d3 with the bishop. 3 pawns down, but all the white pieces are active, very active and attacking, except for the c1 rook, but remember the c1 rook came very shortly too, while black still hasn't finished development. Bishop g4 was played, but after f3, bishop d7. Remember how step by step AlphaZero managed to progress, improve his pieces even further, optimize his pieces move by move, while black didn't have any active counterplay and eventually lost material a couple of moves later, even though AlphaZero didn't want to take the piece, but he finally went on to win an endgame with a piece up. I really enjoyed watching this game, and I hope that you too enjoyed this video. I do recommend that you read the academic paper as well in the Science magazine published by DeepMind to see how AlphaZero mastered not only chess but also shogi and Go, and why these board games can serve as the perfect testing field for artificial intelligence, for a general purpose artificial intelligence system that is DeepMind's AlphaZero, and how by solving intelligence, they can solve bigger problems in the world. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and comment below if you would like me to cover more games by AlphaZero. See you in the next one.